Hello, this is Sean Martin, Editor-in-Chief for ITSP Magazine, and you are very welcome to a new episode of At the Edge here on ITSP Radio. Today I have three guests on the show, Emily Miller, Dean Weber, and Ted Harrington. And at today's intersection, we connect the technological aspects of IoT, OT, and ICS with the societal, more human-oriented aspects of personas and identities. In the end, the question is, are we prepared to deal with the scale that comes with all of the things we plan to connect to the internet? Have a listen to find out. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having us, Sean.
Thanks for having us.
So our chat is around IoT and more of the industrial IoT space and the industrial control system space, and with a deeper focus on identities. And before we get into what that is and why we're talking about it, a quick word from each of you for who you are and what you're up to. So Emily, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Sean. So I'm Emily Miller. I'm the Director of National Security and Critical Infrastructure Programs with Mocana. Basically, I'm an evangelist for securing devices and for focusing on devices and not just network level cybersecurity. And the reason why is we're seeing threat actors use networks as leverage to get to the devices to make them do bad things or corrupt the data.
Perfect. And Dean?
I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Mocana, and I've been in and around the identity space for decades. I guess my interest in this topic is that most industrial devices today don't have a digitally unique, verifiable identity, and that's something that we need to be doing a better job of, both in the industrial space amongst themselves, as well as the industrial space outbound to other connected environments.
Fantastic. Well, it's a pleasure having you on. And Ted, round it out for us.
Sure. Yeah. Ted Harrington. I'm executive partner at Independent Security Evaluators. Our mission is to empower organizations to be able to make a meaningful impact on their pursuit of security. And as I think about how we pursue that, I look at our customers all believe that through rigorous manual white box security assessment, they can be better tomorrow than they are today. And that echoes our ethos exactly. So I'm here today to sort of help apply a security researcher and security consultant perspective to this challenge and hopefully pursue that mission and empower your listeners on what to do about it.
Yeah, it's a great point, Ted. And yeah, our goal here and our job isn't to scare the crap out of people with this conversation. It's more of an enlightening and educational conversation that I'm hoping to have here. So thanks again for everybody joining. The reason this topic is of interest to me is I think there's an area that kind of gets left behind, and Dean, you kind of touched on this a bit, where when we think of, generally speaking, from the information security industry's perspective, when we think of InfoSec, we think of traditional IT systems and applications that run on them and data of customers and business systems, business information that we're trying to protect. And when we talk about identities in that context, the first thing that most often comes to mind is people's privacy, and then second is protecting IP. And what I want to dig into today, though, from an identity perspective, is what are all these things that reside outside of the traditional IT environment, and what role does identity play in that space? So when we look at IoT, a connected TV or a connected fridge, some of those may or may not sit inside a business environment, to scanning machines within a hospital, to pumps and other devices sitting in a manufacturing floor, whatever it might be. So as we move into some of those other, I guess what we can call operational technology spaces, what's the role of identity in that world, or in those worlds. So with that in mind, let's first, because I did a crappy job explaining what some of those systems might be, who can lead us off with what some of those environments look like? What are some of the IoT, industrial IoT systems or devices, and what are industrial control systems, and where might we find some of those things in our world today?
Well, I'd be happy to take a crack at it if you guys are okay with that.
Go for it.
Absolutely.
So just from a very high level, Sean, I actually think you did a really good job of kind of laying out the general domains, and then you kind of hinted on some of the confusion that's around them. So when you're thinking about outside of traditional enterprise environments, you mentioned IoT, which is more of the consumer type devices. So what you're seeing in terms of thermostats, connected fridges, you see all the apps that are on fridges now, stoves, all of that sort of thing, your TVs, those might be called the Internet of Things. So it's actual physical things that are connected to the internet that are talking and doing some sort of functionality. Then on the very opposite end of the spectrum, we sort of started to talk about control systems. In the traditional environments, there are things that are called control systems, which may be a programmable logic controller or a human-machine interface, so PLC and HMI respectively. But essentially those are big machines or computers that will talk to a human operator and also control an industrial process. And those have been around for quite some time. First they started as analog devices, then they have moved into computer-based devices, but they didn't traditionally talk on the internet, so not like your IoT stuff. And sitting in the middle of those are something called industrial IoT. So using the business perspective of what an IoT device might bring, so something that has a control that is doing some interesting stuff, like your TV or your fridge, it's running processes, but not as heavyweight that it's controlling an entire industrial process. So something in an IoT setting, industrial IoT setting, could be a monitoring device. So let's say you have something out in the field that is a sensor and it's taking measurements of some sort of quantity of something and then maybe transmitting that data back for somebody or another machine even perhaps to analyze. And so the industrial IoT sits in the middle. That's not the traditional IoT, which is this panoply of stuff that we don't really know how to quantify, but you can say, or it's huge to quantify, you can say it's more consumer products. And then traditional control systems, there's this industrial IoT perspective sitting in the middle.
So IoT is a big chunk of the billions of connected devices we often hear stats about.
Right. And then from a business perspective, think of all the interesting capabilities that industrial IoT brings to you. So all of those, manufacturing processes, the healthcare components, all of those items that are now connected may not be your traditional control systems, but are providing lots of data back to you, data about the process, data about the functions that are happening with the device, data about whatever it's connected to.
And Ted, I'm interested in your view as you connect with different companies during your travels. What are some of the business processes they're leveraging connected devices to help them either automate or streamline decision-making or take care of actions that might eliminate human error, for example? What are some of the things you're seeing?
Yeah, there's definitely a big divide, or I guess you could say a fork in the road, between connected devices that are to service directly to the consumer. And that's, I think, what most people think that connected devices are. And then the other side is along the lines of sensing equipment and the things that we were just talking about a moment ago. When it comes to, from my observation, where the real business applications seem to be right now for IoT is more in that latter, the lattermost part. I don't see a lot of businesses looking at how can they deploy a smart version of whatever device in their business in order to achieve some sort of business advantage. Those devices seem to have more of like the cool factor to them. It's they want to have the smart fridge in the business because it's cool more so than it helps optimize anything for that particular business. So now there is, of course, the business of selling those types of devices to consumers, but I think that's a little different than what you're asking.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dean, any insight into, I don't know, the first, I often point to two different things. So manufacturing is one area where I can just see a ton of these devices. And then the energy space is another area that comes to mind. And then I often look to the healthcare environment, just because that does land where squarely where we sit from a publication perspective, where there's a direct impact to humans and society. So any additional elaboration on the types of devices and business processes that you're seeing leveraging
Sure.
IoT?
So, first of all, U.S. Department of Homeland Security outlines 16 different areas of critical infrastructure that are all the basic areas of some level of industrial process, from financial services through healthcare, through oil and gas, water and sewage, electricity, the grid. All of these areas have control systems and feedback loops and operations parameters that are then feeding decision systems that sit behind them in a more traditional IT model, but with industrial data, not with IT data. So, in general, if you take a look at the IIoT market, it's about sensor, manager, manager of managers, and then decision support at the back end. And that model doesn't sound all that different from an IT model, except when you get into the real data. So where this becomes important in an IIoT world is if you're going to utilize that industrial data to make important decisions, because that's where another area where IT and OT differ. Typically when we're protecting IP or we're worried about reputational risk or financial loss, we're talking about the IT world. In the OT world, things are a little different, right? We're talking about potentially life-threatening or life-impacting elements. If you lose power for 2 weeks because of a failure of a control system, that becomes a pretty major thing, like happened in 2003 with the Northeast power outage, or what we saw allegedly the Russians do to the Ukraine environment, where they took down the country's power grid in the middle of winter in 2015. So, these things are happening out there. When you think about the data that you're using off of those devices, if you don't have an identity that you can trust, and you don't have a position of trustworthiness in the device itself that is coupled to that identity, how in the world can you ever trust the data that's being generated? So this is why it's important that as we evolve into more connected network spaces so that we can use the data more efficiently and more effectively, we need to be cognizant of the fact that these devices that are in the industrial space, many of them have embedded usernames and passwords, admin. It's if you think back to where we were with IT 15, 20 years ago, that's where OT is today. And there was no impetus to change because all focus was on safety, not on reliability so much, except of the safety systems, and certainly not on security, which is why we have things like embedded usernames and passwords. But the point being is that these elements need to be migrated as we start to collect and start to connect more of these devices to information systems at the back end, because those information systems are generally connected to the internet at some level at some point.
Yeah, and so there's a good transition to the identity piece, because I'm trying to figure out, and I don't want to dig too deep into the trust of the data itself in terms of integrity of the data, but perhaps the creator of that data in the form of a device, and the recipient and decision maker of a data that data that's taking action on it. And so what role, I guess we'll start off this way, what role does identity play in the world of OT, and what's that state? What's the state of that world look like? Are we kind of in a good place, or are there things we need to be looking at?
So from a very high level perspective, so Dean can really talk about the deep tech details, but when you're thinking about identity, in devices. Identity is a fundamental concept for enterprise systems. You need to know what you have, you be able to monitor it, make sure you know who's logging into it, that sort of thing. In an industrial IoT and a control systems environment, as the devices become connected, particularly with devices that are talking to each other. So Sean, you mentioned a decision making based on a data point. Sometimes those decisions are not being made by humans, they're being made by other machines. Identity helps establish trust. Identity helps you being either a machine or an actual person, understand what is this thing that is talking to me. When it's a person walking into a room, you can identify who that person is. If it is a laptop with an ID and you're monitoring the laptop, you can reasonably expect what that laptop is. If it is a headless machine parked out in the middle of nowhere, talking to another machine, how do those machines know what those machines are? How do they know that the data is coming from what they expect to be coming from, that they're making decisions based on true and accurate information from a trustworthy device? This is where the concept of identity comes in and why it is so challenging to implement in industrial IoT and control systems environment. For newer stuff that we're building now, and Dean can talk about this, you can build that in. For older things that were not built, or maybe those functions are not being utilized to have the type of identity that we need, it becomes a little bit more difficult.
And I'll add to that, you know, when we think about traditional OT models of years past, we talked about analog, right? Things that ran on 24 volts DC or operated on make-break signaling at 4 and 20 milliamps. These are analog devices. They were single point of connection along an analog circuit, so you knew what was at the other end of the wire because there was only one end of that wire that could possibly terminate this instruction set. As we digitize all of those, and you know, things like ISA 99 and IEEE are struggling with some of these concepts now, because as we digitize those elements, we now have the ambiguity of the internet starting to become prevalent. And with the data being so critical on these devices, we absolutely need to know who they are, first and foremost, and what their condition is before we can accept the data that is generating from them to be useful in our decision logic and our decision support. So identity is the first component that has to be developed in these devices. And if you look at what NIST has done with 863 and the 3 phases, you're going to start to see all of that being applied to device technology as well, so that when you create an identity and you have to trust that identity, how do you develop that identity so that it is trustworthy in a transferable fashion? And certificates are certainly one way to do that. PKI, there's a lot of proprietary means out there because certificate management has been seen as difficult, although it's getting lots easier over time. But you know, when we're talking billions of devices, as we were talking about with the internet today, you know, we started running out of IPv4 address space, which was a form of identity several years ago. Now when we start adding the industrial space, which is tens and 20s and 30s of billions of devices that are now going to have an identity, identity becomes a much more ambiguous concept of those devices when they start communicating.
One thing we can talk about as we're exploring this particular part of the topic is to step back and say, well, why does this even matter? And that's the question we always ask ourselves about everything anyway, right? So why would identity even matter? And the way that I would answer that would be because it matters in the context of the way that attackers are evolving. And there is a type of attack scenario that we're observing start to take place where attackers rely on manipulating systems. So not necessarily directly exploiting a system, but exploiting the way that a system behaves through its interaction. And so this is not an OT example, but this is a vivid example of what this attack technique might be. So I can tell you a story about some research that we did recently where we were studying medical devices, connected medical devices. But really what we were studying was we were studying the relationship with the device. And after many months of research, essentially what we found was that you could, with a certain type of patient monitor, which is the device that sits by the side of the bed in a patient's room, you could exploit an authentication bypass vulnerability, which enabled an attacker to essentially feed any information they wanted to the device. So they could, for instance, make a perfectly normal patient appear as if that patient was having a cardiac event. Or you could take a patient who was actually having a cardiac event and make it appear as if they were totally fine. In either case, what would happen was that the relationship that the healthcare professionals, the physician has on that device is now manipulated. So a physician might administer care to an otherwise healthy patient or might fail to administer care to a patient who needs it. And that's pretty significant. And I think that puts into context what we're talking about here. That's of course an example of a person could get hurt because of this, but replace person with your business or your system or whatever. And it's a similar idea where reliance on other systems, and are they actually the system they claim to be? Are they a trustworthy system? And is the information that's coming off of that upon which my system will start reacting and making decisions? Is that information that is reliable? And that's why all this matters, because the attackers want to exploit it.
Yeah, so the example you give, Ted, which is a good one, is where the identity has been compromised, basically. And so that may be, hopefully it's a rare case that an identity is compromised in that way. But what I suspect is we have an environment full of things that don't rely on any identity for authentication or for building trust with communications and some of the other things we're talking about here. So in effect, all the identities are compromised or easily spoofed and manipulated because there is no formal identity. Am I on track with that thought, or?
No,
Are you saying across all?
Right. Whoops, we all jump in.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No,
I was
go ahead. Go ahead.
Go for it, Emily.
I was really just going to amplify your point and say, yes, that is exactly right. And, to Ted, really quickly, to your point, you said at the very beginning, this is real. The example you're giving was not operational technology, but it is. And I think that's kind of the rub, is it matters because what we're talking about impacts lives. I'm going to stop there and let everybody else take over because I've been monopolizing the conversation.
And I would say that, identity in the industrial space is bound to the device in some fashion. And not only is the identity compromisable, but the integrity of the device through the identity being compromised for something like Mirai, where a third of the devices that were involved in the botnet were internet-connected devices that weren't necessarily computers. And then we go from there into something like BrickerBot, where we have a very targeted industrial community where, our ability to turn off power to big segments of the country through a bricking piece of malcode that literally not only disables the device, but makes it unusable under any conditions, including factory rebuild at some point in the future, either through overclocking or overtemp or any number of different ways. But the point there is that, identity is a cornerstone of who is it. And if we don't have a solid handle on who it is, then everything else kind of falls apart, right? Because you can't tell me what you are unless you tell me who you are. You can't tell me how you're configured unless you can tell me who you are. And you can't tell me whether you're trustworthy or not unless you can tell me who you are. So identity is literally the cornerstone of the security process around industrial devices that are capable of hosting an identity. And there's tons and tons and tons of devices that can't host an identity.
Well, I actually wanted to touch on that because I think what you're alluding to there are some things where we just have to blindly trust. And I don't know if we're all the way down to a specific sensor sitting on a pipe or on the production floor, for example. I guess what I'm trying to get my head wrapped around is just how many things do we actually have to manage identities for, and are we going to be forced to just live with some things not having an identity or an unmanaged identity in some cases? Because we're talking about billions and billions of things. I could easily say, well, I'll never have to manage all of those. I just have to manage my environment. But that could be a huge number in itself, right?
Absolutely. So I'll take a quick short answer to that and then toss it out for other people. The answer is that in the industrial space, we have the concept of brownfield and greenfield. Greenfield are going to be those new devices that we are building today that will have or should have an identity strongly associated. Brownfield are those millions, if not billions, of devices that are out there that either don't have an identity or the identity is not trustworthy, i.e. username and password admin, where everybody on the planet knows what it is. And so we've got to deal with both ends of that spectrum. It's not an either or, it's a both.
And when we talk identity, IPv4 was brought up earlier as one method to kind of track stuff. MAC addresses are tied to those in the traditional IT world. How does the OT world look in comparison to those two models that I just described?
Well, if you're assuming that that the TCP/IP network is the network of record, and there are 34 or 36 different types of industrial networks, only a few of them which are TCP/IP based. So there's lots of other networking protocols out there that have evolved over the years specifically for the industrial communities. But assuming that we're talking about TCP/IP based, we have the same levels of identity associated with MAC address, with a assigned or an embedded TCP/IP address, v4 or v6 or both. But at the end of the day, they still have all the same vulnerabilities that v4 and v6 has in the IT space, where an identity can be spoofed if you're just relying on an IP address, and the MAC address can be spoofed if you have access to certain information. Then all of those things are the same level of reality. And again, the difference here being is that in the industrial space, we're talking about lives and the ability of people to live well. In the IT space, you're talking about the ability to make money and trust IP and secure IP, et cetera. So the priorities in the OT space tend to be a little bit bigger because of the criticality of the environment.
Yeah, and to amplify that, what Dean's talking about is the creation of immutable identities. So identities that cannot or are really hard to change among themselves. They're not just relying on an IP address, for example. And there are technically ways to do that, but that's a longer and more in-depth conversation.
Much.
Yes. So we're coming up. I feel like I've learned a bit, but maybe not. Maybe still quite immature in my understanding of all this stuff. I suspect we can continue to talk for ages. But what I'd like to do is maybe break this down in final thoughts from 3 different perspectives, and I'll call it the builder, deployer, breaker. I don't know if those are the right proper terms for what we talk about, these 3 different groups. But advice for people building connected devices from an identity perspective, what should they look at? Advice for people deploying them, and then the hackers and the white hat hackers trying to protect them, looking at it from a breaker perspective. So I'll kind of reserve that last bit for Ted, and then Dean, Emily, kind of if you can take a look at the builder deployer spaces and flip a coin and give us some advice.
Yeah, Dean, you take OEM, I'll take operator.
Okay. So, quite simply, when we're building the devices today, we have to include the concept of identity in the design of the build, just like we should include the concept of trustworthiness in the device as it's built. Because if we follow the IT model of bolt on, some more, we're gonna end up in the same place, which is there's going to be something new to bolt on next week and the week after that and maybe the month after that. And we, because of the criticality of the OT environment, we can't do that. We can't wait for something bad to happen and then try to fix it. So building identity, strong identity, whether that's a X509 certificate or associated PKI or some other form of, as Emily pointed out, immutable or relatively immutable identity, depending on the criticality of the device, is something that we have to consider in every build. And you're going to start seeing more and more regulation on those industrial communities coming out around that. So at the end of the day, the OEM world is going to have to take into consideration, how do I develop a very strong conveyable identity that may be the basis for trustworthiness into my device? Because if I don't do that at all levels, I'm just setting myself up for failure and heartbreak and potentially loss of life down the road.
Yeah, that sets the stage for you, Emily. Obviously, it'd be nice to have everything shiny and new, but that's not always the case that your managers of these things have to deal with, right?
Right. And I think for operators, there's a whole host of recommendations we can give, but there's two things that I would focus on. Number one is everybody at every industry and every critical sector has, uses, and or relies on operational technology. And I'm kind of centering around what I've heard a lot, and Ted, this is not to call out you at all, but I know this is an operational technology, and then they give an example that is operational technology. It is not just water, energy, and oil and natural gas type of stuff. It's also connected combines. It's, your dams that are using ancient equipment that's suddenly connected. It's everybody. It's your HVAC systems. It's, all these interconnected systems of devices. So that's number one, is everybody has operational technology. And number two is you gotta know what you have. And this is part of, I don't know if you know the NIST cyber security risk management framework, which identifies, what you need to do. And the first step is identify what you got. And this is, in the realm of identity that we're talking about, figure out what you have that's operational technology. What's going to cause you to have a bad day, and quantify what that is. That may be a business impact, that may be a life impact, it might be a safety impact. And then you need to figure out in the security steps, what do you need to do? Either new equipment that you can have an identity on there, or old equipment that you need to assign an identity to, either an updatable brownfield device or via a proxy like a gateway.
Ted, kind of full circle this stuff for us with breaking it all up. taking it offline. What advice for companies that have to think from the point of view of an attacker?
Yeah, that's certainly where we spend all of our time, right? Is trying to think about how hackers would break things in order to figure out how to fix it, right? And make sure that doesn't happen. And so I think the key advice that I would give to your listeners would be to do two things. Thing number one is to design and implement a threat model. So if you're not familiar with what that is, that's essentially an exercise through which you go to articulate what assets you want to protect, who are the adversaries that you're worried about defending against. Do you care about nation states or not? Do you care about organized crime or not? And then the third thing is, what are your attack surfaces? So what are do you have a mobile app, or where's the authentication? Do you integrate with a backend? All these types of places where an attacker might focus their energies. So what that does is that helps you understand and build your strategy in terms of where are we going to allocate our resources. I was just teaching a workshop the other day, and I polled the audience, and I said, show of hands, who here has unlimited resources? And everyone sort of chuckles, and obviously no one raises their hands. And the point that I was making is this one, right? We have finite resources. So we need to allocate them in the way best aligned with what we're trying to defend. So that's thing number one, build a threat model. And thing number two is build a trust model. And so this is sort of the inverse of a threat model. Not exactly the inverse, but it's rather than thinking about what are the things that are the big scary animals that are going to attack me. It's what are the cute little puppies that I'm okay petting, right? So who do I trust? Why do I trust that person or thing? And how do I provision or revoke trust? Which essentially all boils back down to the theme here today, essentially has to do with identity. But it's who are the people, things, organizations, etc., that are worthy of being provided access to your assets that you've outlined in your threat model, and so on.
What I would say is, as my final thought, just after hearing everybody give their thoughts, is kind of to your point, Ted, of we don't have to introduce exposure for this just because we can, right? We don't have to connect something because we can. Take a look at what you're trying to accomplish and figure out the reason it is connected, and then how to ensure that it stays safe while it is connected. And to your point of the inverse of that, if you don't have to, don't connect it and give yourself that exposure if you don't have to, or do it in a way that makes sense. So yeah, like I said earlier, I think I've learned something, therefore I feel less smart. So I appreciate everybody for enlightening me a bit here, and hopefully our audience gets to learn something from everybody as well. I appreciate you all taking the time to share.
Thanks for
the opportunity, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.